Usually when we look up at the night sky, we have this, well, this really ingrained expectation of physical reality.
Right. We want things to make sense.
Exactly. We are completely trained to think like astronomers or like military pilots. You see a blinking light, the radar pings, and it shows this solid object moving at a certain speed.
On a specific trajectory, yeah.
Right. And the pilot just points at the green screen and says, there is a craft. It's a machine. It's something we could theoretically, walk up to and touch.
It's comforting, honestly. I mean, we deeply prefer our mysteries to be tangible.
Yeah.
We want them bound by gravity, bound by physics, thermodynamics, all of that. We want anomalies that we can eventually, anyway, shoot down, reverse engineer, and put in a heavily guarded hangar somewhere.
Steel, titanium, advanced propulsion. It's clean.
Hmm.
But then you step into the world of what people are actually encountering out there, what the military is actually recording, and suddenly that radar screen is just completely useless.
Completely. It falls apart.
We're looking at a phenomenon that is shape-shifting.
Mm-hmm.
It's murky. It violates the laws of physics 1 second, and then it just vanishes the next. And it leaves behind not just physical traces, but this massive psychological fallout.
Which is, it is the absolute definition of ontological shock.
Oh, totally.
You are taking everything we assume about the physical universe, everything the Enlightenment taught us about how reality works, and you're just turning it completely inside out. You aren't just discovering a new species out there. You are discovering that the rules of the game are entirely different than what we were told.
And that profound, incredibly uncomfortable realization is exactly where we are going today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
We are exploring a radical paradigm shift that is quietly gaining a lot of traction at the highest levels of society right now. We're pulling from a truly massive and honestly incredibly unsettling conversation. It's a recent interview on the Winston YouTube channel featuring the journalist and author Dreher.
Yeah, and the central premise of that interview is huge.
It really is. It's this growing idea that what we have been calling extraterrestrials for the last, 70-plus years might actually be interdimensional spiritual entities.
And crucially, how this alleged phenomenon connects directly to a much broader cultural hunger. We are looking at a society that is hyper-technological, completely post-materialist, yet absolutely starving for what we might call enchantment.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our sources today cast an incredibly wide net. We are pulling threads that connect Silicon Valley elites, top-tier military intelligence, ancient theology, and even modern pop culture blockbusters.
It covers a lot of ground.
It does. But before we really get rolling, I want to make our parameters clear to you, the listener. The source material contains mentions of several politically charged figures and movements. You're going to hear names like Vice President J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson, and we will be unpacking the rise of certain right-wing nationalist movements later on.
Right.
I just want to state unequivocally that we are not here to endorse, validate, or take sides on any of those political viewpoints.
Yeah, we are strictly here to impartially examine the ideas, the claims, and the cultural analysis exactly as they're presented in the original source material. Exactly. Our job is to synthesize the information, not to offer any kind of political endorsement. We're dissecting the cultural arguments being made, observing this whole phenomenon from a sociological and philosophical bird's-eye view.
The mission today is specifically for you, someone who wants to look past the surface-level noise of pop culture, past the 15-second sound bites, and actually understand the deep tectonic shifts in how our society views the supernatural. So let's start with this redefining of the extraterrestrial. Are we looking at spaceships, or are we looking at spirits?
It's a wild shift in perspective.
It is, and the deep dive kicks off with a startling quote. Dreher cites Vice President J.D. Vance, who reportedly summarized his view on the UFO phenomenon by just flat out saying, "I don't think they're aliens, I think they're demons."
Which is, it is a jarring statement to hear from a modern political figure.
Yeah, you don't expect that on the news.
No, but it perfectly encapsulates the thesis of the argument we're analyzing today. The argument posits that these entities, whatever they actually are not human. And furthermore, they are not biological space travelers from Zeta Reticuli or anywhere else in the cosmos.
Right.
They possess effectively infinite powers, and most importantly, they are here with an agenda to deceive and to conquer.
And if that just sounds like, I don't know, a religious figure mapping their theology onto a secular mystery, the source material throws a massive curveball. It introduces this anonymous reporter.
Yeah, this guy is fascinating.
He really is. He's described as an atheist, a hard-nosed journalist working for a major American magazine. He didn't come at this looking for demons at all. He started investigating this because his college roommate had actually fallen into a literal UFO cult.
Right, where the members worshipped aliens as literal gods.
Exactly. And he wanted to understand the psychological mechanism there. Like, how does an intelligent modern person fall into that kind of trap? So, utilizing his journalistic credentials, he starts knocking on doors.
He gets access to key people, too.
Oh, major access. People in the U.S. Congress, the military, intelligence services, the people actually getting the classified briefings.
And the consensus he found behind closed doors is just staggering.
Yeah. He calls up Dreher after doing all this digging and basically says every one of them said, yeah, this phenomenon is real, the crafts are real, but they're not creatures from other planets. They are not extraterrestrials.
The phrase that is constantly used in these classified briefings and these Pentagon back channels is interdimensional entities.
Interdimensional.
That vocabulary shift is so critical because when military intelligence stops using the word extraterrestrial and starts using interdimensional, they are admitting a failure of the materialist model.
Wow, yeah.
They are saying these things don't fly here from Mars. They bleed over from a reality that exists parallel to or outside of our physical dimension.
What's wild is that the heavyweights of the UFO research world have been screaming this exact theory for decades. Jacques Vallée is heavily featured in the source material here.
What's fascinating here is Vallée's background. If you know anything about the lore of UAPs, he is the undisputed grand old man of the field.
Yeah, he's legendary. Francois Truffaut actually played a character directly based on him in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
He is the ultimate insider. But the critical detail is that he is a French computer scientist. He is a man of logic, data, algorithms. He is a hardware guy.
Right, he's not a theologian.
Not at all. He is not known as a religious man. Yet, after studying this phenomenon exhaustively since the 1960s, he has concluded that it is deeply, undeniably spiritual.
He argues that what we call UFOs today, the metallic discs, the tic-tacs, the black triangles, that's just a modern manifestation of entities that have appeared throughout all of human history. We just put a different skin on them based on the era we live in and the technology we happen to understand.
Right. So in the Middle Ages, he believes these exact same entities showed up as fairies or elves or mythological creatures.
And today, in our hyper-scientific age, they show up as space creatures in metallic ships.
It's an adaptation to the observer's expectations. Think of it like a computer virus updating its user interface.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, if a virus wants to trick you into downloading it today, it disguises itself as a legitimate email from your bank.
Right, it looks like a FedEx tracking link.
Exactly. But 50 years ago, a con artist would disguise themselves as a door-to-door salesman. Vallée's work suggests a form of cosmic mimicry. The phenomenon tailors its appearance to perfectly bypass our cultural defense mechanisms.
To really underscore how seriously Vallée takes the spiritual or even demonic angle of this, the source mentions his interaction with Diana Pasulka. She is a Catholic academic who studies UAP lore as an emerging religion.
Right.
When she met with Vallée, this totally secular, data-driven computer scientist handed her a book to help her understand the phenomenon. It wasn't a physics textbook. It wasn't a manual on aerospace engineering. It was a collection of Catholic theological essays from the 1950s titled Satan. And he told her, you need to find a copy of this because I think this will give us a big clue as to what we're dealing with here.
That is just incredible coming from him.
It is. But I have to push back here because this is where my brain starts to kind of glitch.
Okay, let's hear it.
We are taking literal hardware, flying saucers that are purportedly being tracked on Raytheon radar systems, objects dropping from 80,000 feet to sea level in seconds, displacing water, leaving actual radiation traces in the dirt. And we are calling it software.
It's tough to wrap your head around.
It really is. We're calling it spiritual energy. How does the source material reconcile the intensely physical presence of these crafts with the idea that they are just deceptive spiritual entities? I mean, a demon shouldn't have a radar cross-section.
It is the ultimate stumbling block for the modern mind, isn't it? How can a spirit reflect a radar ping? The source material uses a very specific biblical and theological counterpoint to explain this mechanism. Dreher points out that in traditional theology, particularly in the Old Testament, angels regularly took on physical material forms.
Wait, are we talking about the angels visiting Abraham?
Exactly those. The three angels who visited Abraham in the desert didn't appear as this ethereal, ghostly light.
Right.
They appeared as physical travelers. They sat down. They ate solid food. They occupied physical space and interacted with the material environment.
Oh, wow.
In the Eastern Orthodox Church, there is a very famous, highly revered icon painted by Andrei Rublev depicting this exact scene. It's used to represent the Holy Trinity. The theological logic here is ironclad within its own framework.
Riches.
If angels, which are fundamentally spiritual beings, can manipulate matter to take on a temporary material aspect, and if demons are simply fallen angels retaining their original nature, then demons absolutely possess the capability to manifest physically.
So the argument is that they aren't bound by matter, but they can manipulate it. They can create a temporary physical reality, a projection, for the sheer sake of deception.
That is the core mechanism. They present a physical form that the modern weird mind will accept.
You're right.
Because if they appeared today as a winged, cloven-hoofed demon smelling of sulfur, we would either dismiss it as a hallucination or we would immediately recognize it as a spiritual threat and seek religious protection.
We grab holy water.
Exactly. By appearing as highly advanced extraterrestrial technology, they completely bypass our spiritual defense mechanisms. They appeal directly to the only thing modern society actually worships, which is advanced science and technology.
Man, it's a Trojan horse made of titanium instead of wood.
That's exactly what it is.
But if they are demons masquerading as aliens, their ultimate goal wouldn't just be to fly around and baffle fighter pilots. They don't want to interact. They want to mess with us on a psychological and spiritual level.
Absolutely.
So what does that ground-level experience actually look like when an ordinary person encounters this phenomenon?
This is where the source material moves from theory into terrifying personal accounts. We have to look at a chilling case study of a man they refer to as Nino.
Oh, Nino's story is fascinating because he is not someone looking for attention at all. He is described as a strict, conservative Catholic lawyer, a very grounded, serious professional.
Very credible witness.
Right. But it started when he was a teenager. He was driving his pickup truck through a rural countryside when he saw a giant, completely silent UFO hovering low over a field. He stopped the truck, stared at it, and then he just drove on.
He buried the experience entirely. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't tell his family. He assumed, probably correctly for the time, that no one would ever believe him, and he just didn't want the stigma.
But burying it didn't make it go away.
Yeah.
7 years pass. He is now deeply embedded in law school, living in an apartment in Chicago.
Right. Totally focused on the mundane world.
Yeah. He's sitting at his kitchen table doing what law students do, studying dense texts, completely grounded in material reality. And suddenly, the impossible happens. A literal portal, a rip in the fabric of the room, opens up on the wall of his kitchen.
It's terrifying. And out of this portal emerge two humanoid beings. But they aren't described as little green men in spacesuits. They are described as shimmering, made of flowing, oscillating energy.
And they don't speak out loud. They communicate with him telepathically, directly into his mind.
Mm-hmm.
And what they do is so bizarrely specific. They don't offer him the secrets of the universe or anything. They engage in these trivial but highly manipulative displays of power.
Right, to prove what they can do.
Yeah, they start proving to him that they know the future. They would telepathically tell him a car is about to backfire on the street below. A second later, bang, a car backfires exactly as predicted. Then they just vanish.
And Nino's reaction is crucial here because he acts exactly how our modern societal conditioning dictates we should act. He doesn't grab a crucifix or start praying. He drives himself straight to the nearest hospital. He assumes a purely biological material failure. He says, I must be having a psychotic break. Give me an MRI, give me a brain scan, test my blood.
He assumes his own hardware is failing.
Exactly.
But the tests all come back completely clear. There is no tumor, no chemical imbalance, no history of schizophrenia. He is perfectly, certifiably healthy, yet the entities keep returning to his apartment.
And the source notes a specific pattern here. They would typically manifest during times of high emotional stress, like during his law school exams.
Right.
And crucially, their appearances started being accompanied by intense poltergeist activity. Objects moving on their own, physical disturbances in the home, lights flickering.
Which is a massive tell. If you look at the broad spectrum of testimonies from UFO experiencers, there's a recurring, undeniable overlap. It is rarely just a clean, clinical sighting of a craft.
No, almost never.
The phenomenon almost always descends into high strangeness. The UFO sighting acts as a catalyst for poltergeist activity, profound psychological torment, and sometimes generational haunting. It behaves exactly like demonic oppression in traditional literature.
When Dreher interviewed Nino, he asked a very pointed question. He said, "You're a Catholic. Did you ever pray when these things showed up?"
And Nino said yes. Eventually he did, and Dreher asked what happened. Nino replied, they would disappear.
And that exposes the profound cognitive dissonance of the modern experiencer. Dreher asks him, did the fact that they fled from Christian prayer not tell you that there might be something demonic here?
Yeah.
And Nino admits he simply never cranked it that way. His cultural conditioning was so strong that he assumed if they were demons, they would act like movie demons.
All right, they'd spin his head around.
Yeah, they would want to actively fight him, curse him, possess him violently, so the subtle deception completely worked on him.
He ended up getting married. And the catalyst for finally seeking serious help was that his new wife began seeing the entities in their home, too.
That's the breaking point.
That proved to him it wasn't a private hallucination. It was an objective reality.
Yeah.
Ultimately, he is advised to go to an archdiocesan exorcist.
Yeah.
And the exorcist doesn't bat an eye. He basically says, yeah, we've dealt with this specific manifestation before.
Wow.
He says some minor deliverance prayers over Nino, blesses the home, and the problem instantly stops. 3 years later, Nino tells Dreher, those things thought they were going to drive me away from my faith, but they've made me a more faithful Christian.
It is a remarkable narrative arc. But the source material is really careful to show that this isn't just a Catholic phenomenon. The host of the interview, Winston Marshall, along with Dreher, brings in other anecdotes to illustrate that this profound spiritual intrusion crosses all demographic and religious lines.
Right, there is the deeply tragic story of a Jewish medical professional. After her husband died by suicide, she was trying to process the grief by writing a memoir about the experience. And while she was writing, her house became filled with intense, terrifying poltergeist activity.
And Dreher hints that there were dark circumstances surrounding the husband's suicide that indicated a potential possession or severe spiritual oppression prior to his death.
Right.
The outcome for the widow was profound, though. The bizarre, terrifying activity in her home completely shattered her materialist worldview. It opened her up to a deep, undeniable spiritual awareness. She didn't convert to Christianity, she remained Jewish, but she could no longer deny the objective reality of the supernatural realm.
And then Winston Marshall brings up a very relatable, almost ubiquitous experience. He shares a story about a friend of his who suffers from severe night terrors, also known as sleep paralysis.
Right, a lot of people have that.
Yeah, it's super common. During these episodes, she is paralyzed in bed and sees demonic entities in her room. Now, sleep paralysis is a widely reported phenomenon across various cultures, totally independent of religion. But what is striking is her specific description of the demons. She says they look exactly like the Dementors from the Harry Potter films.
The hovering, cloaked, soul-sucking entities.
Exactly.
These stories highlight a profound theme running through the source material. The intense, suffocating isolation of these experiencers. The Jewish widow, the law student, the friend with night terrors. The sources explicitly note that these people are absolutely terrified to talk about what is happening to them in public.
They're terrified of being laughed out of the room.
Yeah.
They're terrified of being deemed a loony by their educated, sophisticated friends. They fear losing their jobs, their social standing.
Because our modern society's default mechanism is extreme, hostile skepticism. We force these incredibly profound, often terrifying experiences into the shadows. We have built a culture that cannot tolerate any data point that violates a strict materialist worldview, so we diagnose the experiencer with a psychological disorder and just ignore the phenomenon altogether.
But Winston's friend, seeing a demon that looks exactly like a pop culture monster like a Dementor, brings up a really wild chicken and egg scenario for you to think about. I mean, did J.K. Rowling and pop culture invent these shapes out of thin air and now our dreaming brains are just projecting them? Or is pop culture actually tapping into and reflecting ancient, objective demonic forms that have existed long before cinema or novels?
That is the pivotal question, and it transitions us into some of the most bizarre historical realities of the 20th century, because the connection between the occult, human culture, and the origin of the UFO phenomenon is much deeper and significantly stranger than most people realize.
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting. If these entities are interacting with us and shaping themselves to our culture, how much did we actively invite them in? Let's look at the occult roots of the UFO era.
Okay.
The source takes us back over a century, setting the stage in 1919 in Cairo, Egypt.
Right, we are introduced to a figure who casts a massive shadow over the 20th century, Aleister Crowley. He is arguably the most infamous, influential occultist of the modern era. He literally dubbed himself the Great Beast.
Crowley was in Cairo performing a complex magic ritual, attempting to summon an entity from another realm. He believed he was making contact with an ancient Egyptian god or a highly evolved interdimensional spirit. He called this entity Lamb.
Lamb, right.
And here is where it gets incredibly weird. Crowley drew a portrait of Lamb based on his interactions. If you look at this drawing from 1919 decades before Roswell, decades before Hollywood popularized the image, it looks exactly like a modern pop culture gray alien.
The resemblance is undeniable. It has the massive, bulbous, oversized head, the diminutive lower face, the slit mouth, and the huge, dark, almond-shaped eyes. It is virtually indistinguishable from the classic alien iconography we all know today.
But Crowley didn't call it an extraterrestrial.
No, he called it a spiritual intelligence.
Fast forward a few decades. The world has gone through World War II. It's 1946. Two of Aleister Crowley's most devoted, high-level disciples decide to perform a highly complex, incredibly dangerous Crowley ritual in the California desert. The ritual is called the Babylon Working.
Right.
Their stated explicit goal is to summon these interdimensional gods down into physical reality to fundamentally transform the world order.
And it is absolutely vital to note who these two men were. This is not some fringe conspiracy theory cooked up on an internet forum. It is documented historical fact. One of these men was Jack Parsons.
Yeah, this blows my mind.
Parsons wasn't a drifter. He was a brilliant rocket scientist, a prodigy in solid fuel propulsion, and one of the principal founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL.
We are talking about the very foundation of the American space program. The guy who helped invent the rockets that eventually took us to the moon was out in the desert chanting occult incantations.
Yes, it's the overlap of the highest echelons of material science and the deepest depths of the occult. And the other man assisting him in this ritual was L. Ron Hubbard, who would shortly after go on to found the Church of Scientology, arguably the most successful science fiction-based religion in history.
So you have a pioneering rocket scientist and a future cult leader out in the desert, pushing the boundaries of dark magic to summon interdimensional beings in 1946. What is the fallout? Exactly 1 year later, in 1947, an American pilot named Kenneth Arnold reports seeing a formation of flying saucers skipping across the sky near Mount Rainier.
While the source acknowledges that pilots saw bizarre, unexplained lights known as Foo Fighters during World War II, 1947 is universally recognized as the explosion of the modern UFO era. Roswell happens that exact same year.
Dreher openly speculates about this timeline, and honestly, you can't blame him. He suggested the Babylon working ritual performed by Parsons and Hubbard might have literally metaphysically parted the veil between dimensions, creating a tier that allowed these entities to flood into our reality.
If we connect this to the bigger picture and entertain that hypothesis, we have to immediately look at how society has been conditioned to receive these entities since that veil was supposedly parted.
Right.
How did we go from fearing demons to welcoming aliens? The source brings us back to Jacques Vallée, who argues that Hollywood has served as the primary engine for this cultural conditioning.
He points the finger directly at the most influential storyteller of the 20th century, Steven Spielberg. Vallée argues that movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T. the Extraterrestrial have actively, aggressively conditioned global society to view these alien entities not as threats, but as our ultimate saviors.
They are portrayed with almost messianic qualities. They are godlike figures descending from the heavens in glowing ships to sort us out, to teach us universal love and compassion, to cure our diseases, and to stop us from destroying ourselves with nuclear weapons.
They fill the exact psychological void left by the decline of traditional religion. Dreher actually offers a remarkably dark, counterintuitive critique of the movie E.T. He calls it twisted and quite evil. Now, I know that sounds extreme for a beloved 1980s family movie. People hear that and think, come on, it's about a kid and his glowing-fingered friend eating Reese's Pieces.
Yeah, it sounds like an overreaction at first.
But Dreher's argument is that the movie fundamentally reverses the natural, moral, and societal order.
Think about the core narrative. We traditionally teach children to be wary of the unknown. Never take candy from strangers, never invite a strange entity into your home, and certainly never hide a secret stranger in your bedroom away from your parents.
Right.
But E.T. completely flips that script. The children are depicted as spiritually pure enough to harbor this bizarre, telepathic alien creature, and they are forced to take the alien side against the adult human world. The adults, The scientists, the government, the parents, are portrayed as cold, rational, invasive, and inherently evil.
It's a subtle, brilliant moral inversion. The alien becomes the ultimate good, and human authority becomes the enemy. And this conditioning has real-world consequences today. The source mentions a documentary series on Netflix called Encounters, which, ironically, Spielberg's production company actually helped produce.
That is ironic.
In one episode, they interview a man from Central Texas. He's a devout Christian who homeschools his massive family. And he is literally teaching his children, as part of their daily Bible study, that UFOs are literal angels sent by God.
Dreher looks at that and sounds a massive alarm. He predicts we are going to see a huge wave of this specific delusion. As the world becomes more politically anxious, ecologically troubled, culturally fragmented, people are going to look to the skies for salvation.
They want a savior.
Yes, but they won't be looking for God in a traditional sense. They'll be looking for signs and wonders from these glowing crafts. They will welcome them with open arms, completely unaware that they are inviting in something ancient, predatory, and demonic.
To hammer this point home, the expert in our source, Diana Pasulka, highly recommends a piece of fiction to understand the reality of the situation. It's a 1953 science fiction novel by Arthur C. Clarke called Childhood's End.
It is arguably the most profound piece of literature for this exact conversation, and its prescience is terrifying.
Tell us about it.
In the novel, the human race is on the brink of total nuclear annihilation during the Cold War. Suddenly, massive, imposing alien ships appear hovering over all the major cities on Earth. The aliens, known as the Overlords, announce they're taking over. They will govern humanity, eradicate all war, end poverty, and bring total world peace.
But there are strings attached.
Major strings. First, the aliens absolutely refuse to show their physical forms. They rule entirely from the shadows. The alien controller, a being named Crowley, only communicates from behind a one-way screen.
Right.
And second, they systematically set out to completely eradicate the memory of traditional religion, specifically Christianity, from human culture. They use a device to look back in time and basically debunk religious miracles, destroying humanity's faith.
About halfway through the novel, a generation has passed. Humanity has been totally pacified, living in a golden age of material comfort. The cultural memory of religion has been completely wiped. It is only then that Krellin, the alien controller, finally steps out from behind the screen and reveals his physical form to the world.
And what does he look like? He looks exactly like a classical medieval demon. He has horns, cloven hooves, leathery bat-like wings, and a forked tail.
But the horrifying, brilliant twist of the novel is that humanity accepts him. They don't scream in terror, because the cultural memory of what a demon looks like, what a demon represents, and why you should fear it has been entirely erased.
The overlords have scrubbed the hard drive of human culture.
Exactly. The only people who recognize him for the ancient threat he is are the few remaining marginalized religious believers, and nobody listens to them.
Arthur C. Clarke was a staunch atheist. He wasn't trying to write a Christian warning manual. But Dreher argues the book perfectly, if accidentally, illustrates the demonic game plan. To deceive us with promises of material peace and technological advancement, to subjugate us, and to lead us away from the divine by methodically erasing our cultural and spiritual defense mechanisms.
Which brings us to a critical, unavoidable juncture in this whole discussion. If our cultural conditioning has successfully erased our ability to recognize profound spiritual danger, how did we get here? This didn't happen overnight with a Spielberg movie. How did Western civilization arrive at this point of total, confident spiritual blindness?
It's a great question.
Why does everything we've talked about for the last half hour sound absolutely crazy to the average listener? The source material addresses this skepticism head-on. It points directly to the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the absolute dominance of the materialist worldview. We need to look at how our brains were literally rewired.
Dreher brings up the groundbreaking work of Harvard evolutionary anthropologist Joe Henrich. Henrich coined a now famous acronym to describe modern Western people, WEIRD. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic.
Henrich's team was looking at the history of psychological research, and they discovered something astonishing, actually a massive blind spot. Almost all foundational psychological studies, the ones that defined what is normal human behavior, were conducted on weird subjects, mostly Western college students.
Right.
Yet Western psychology simply assumed its findings were universally applicable to all of humanity, past and present.
But they absolutely aren't. People from weird societies don't just have different opinions. They perceive the physical world, process visual information, categorize relationships, and view themselves fundamentally differently than people from non-weird societies, and completely differently from our historical ancestors.
One of the defining foundational characteristics of weird culture is the absolute, unyielding separation of the spiritual and material worlds. For most of human history, and in many non-Western indigenous cultures today, that separation simply does not exist.
No, so supernatural isn't supernatural, it's just a facet of daily reality.
To explain how our brains literally change to enforce this separation, the source cites the brilliant psychiatrist and neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist and his massive book, The Matter with Things. McGilchrist argues that modern humans, particularly in the West, have become excessively pathologically less-brained.
Let's dive deep into this because it explains so much. The left hemisphere of the brain is essentially the administrator.
Okay.
It is focused on logic, categorization, mechanics, and utility. It breaks complex things down into manageable parts. It likes spreadsheets, it likes data, it likes things it can control. We have become a society completely dominated by the left hemisphere.
We only accept as true what can be measured in a laboratory, mapped on a graph, or proven with an equation.
Meanwhile, we completely marginalize and ignore the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is where we process holistic meaning, intuition, metaphor, and connection to the broader cosmos. It is the hemisphere that understands truths accessed through religion, poetry, art, liturgy, and human connection. By ignoring it, we have blinded ourselves to half of reality.
Yuval Noah Harari, the historian, makes a brilliant observation about when and how this shift occurred. He notes that around 1500 AD, at the dawn of the scientific revolution, Western civilization made a fateful foundational trade.
We traded meaning for power.
Think about the mechanics of that trade. Before 1500, the universe was viewed as infused with divine purpose. A forest wasn't just lumber, it was a sacred creation. But to truly master the physical world, we had to strip it of that sanctity. We decided that the material world had no inherent divine meaning.
It wasn't sacred, it was just stuff.
Just dead atoms and molecules bumping into each other.
And because it was just dead stuff, there were no moral or spiritual limits on how we could treat it. We could subjugate nature, dissect it, burn it, exploit it to our will. We didn't have to ask the forest spirits for permission to chop down the trees anymore.
And the trade worked perfectly. That materialist mindset yielded the Industrial Revolution, modern medicine, the internal combustion engine, the microprocessor, the internet. We gained immense, godlike technological wealth and absolute power over the natural world.
But the tragic result of that trade is exactly what McGilchrist points out. We now possess total mastery over matter, we have infinite riches, but we are completely, utterly miserable.
Yeah, we're experiencing a profound crisis of meaning.
We are losing our humanity because we have amputated our connection to anything transcendent.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener? If I can use an analogy here, it feels like humanity bought the ultimate, top-of-the-line hardware upgrade for our society. We have 8K resolution screens, quantum processors, instant global communication. But in the process of the upgrade, we completely deleted our internal operating system. The screen is beautiful, but the computer doesn't know why it's turned on. It has no purpose. But I have to challenge this premise a bit, because if you look around today, isn't a return to spiritualism exactly what we are seeing?
What do you mean?
I mean, look at TikTok. People are manifesting, they're using healing crystals, they are getting deep into astrology and tarot. Materialism seems to be cracking.
You are absolutely correct, and the source material heavily emphasizes this exact point. The pendulum is swinging back, and it is swinging back violently away from strict atheistic materialism.
Right.
People cannot live in a dead universe.
Right.
But here is the critical danger. It is not necessarily swinging back toward traditional structured religion. It is swinging toward a chaotic, unsupervised, completely bespoke spiritualism.
It's a consumer-driven spirituality. You pick the aesthetic of the occult that you like, you ignore the rules you don't like, and you just build your own religion.
Yeah, and that unsupervised a la carte spiritualism leads us directly to the extreme vulnerability of the youngest generation. Let's look at Gen Z, the occult revival, and the terrifying rise of the orthobros.
Dreher shares a really illuminating conversation he had at Oxford with a 27-year-old Anglican ordinand named Daniel Kim. Dreher, who is in his 50s, grew up in the culture wars where the primary opponent of faith was the new atheism of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens.
Right.
So he assumed the biggest challenge facing Christianity today was still atheism. But Kim corrects him immediately. He says atheism was the challenge for the older boomer and Gen X generations. For Gen Z, atheism is boring. The greatest challenge they are facing is the overwhelming allure of the occult.
Kim explained that before he went to seminary, he worked in a standard corporate office in London. He's the only practicing Christian there, but he noted there wasn't a single atheist in the office either.
Not one.
Not one. Every single person in his peer group was involved in the occult to some degree. Astrology, witchcraft, energy healing.
He even worked alongside two open, practicing Satanists.
Yeah.
And their reasoning for being Satanists was fascinating. They didn't worship Satan because they wanted to be evil movie villains or sacrifice animals. They genuinely believed that following Satan, rejecting all external moral authority, was the best, most authentic way to be fully human.
This anecdotal evidence is heavily backed up by current academic research, too. Scholar Tara Isabella Burton wrote a fantastic book called Strange Rites. She confirms that young people today are absolutely desperate for enchantment. They grew up in a sterile, weird, algorithmic world, and they are starving for the supernatural. They want magic to be real.
But they categorically reject traditional Christianity or Orthodox Judaism. Why? Because traditional religion requires moral boundaries. It demands a specific code of conduct, particularly regarding sexual ethics, self-denial, and submitting your will to a higher authority.
And Gen Z has been raised to believe that submitting your will to anyone is a form of oppression.
Satanism, witchcraft, and the occult offer a terrifyingly attractive alternative for the modern mind. They offer a consumer transaction. They offer all the supernatural enchantment, all the raw spiritual power and aesthetic mystery without any of the moral restrictions.
Yeah.
You can cast a spell to get the job you want, hex your ex, and you don't have to change your behavior or submit to a moral code.
The source illustrates the profound danger of this transaction with the story of a young man they call Jonah.
Oh, Jonah's story is intense.
Jonah was a smart guy, a deeply intellectual academic. He was raised in standard suburban American evangelicalism, but it fell incredibly shallow to him. It offered basic moral uplift and rock music on Sundays, but it couldn't answer his deep intellectual, historical, or mystical questions about the nature of reality.
So in graduate school, actively searching for true visceral transcendence, he wanders away from the church and joins a literal occult coven. He gets involved in heavy, consciousness-altering drug use, participates in intense occult worship rituals, and actively, willingly welcomes spiritual possession, believing he is channeling divine energy.
He genuinely believed he was worshiping ancient, forgotten gods, pagan deities that oppressive Christianity had unfairly crushed centuries ago.
But eventually, the mask slipped. The UI updated. He realized with absolute horror that these weren't benevolent ancient gods of nature. They were demonic entities, and they were methodically destroying his mind and his life. He barely escaped with his sanity, fleeing back to Christianity for protection.
It's a stark, terrifying warning about playing with occult fire just because you're bored with materialism. However, the source material is incredibly balanced here. It doesn't just critique the progressive, occult-leaning youth. It points out that even when Gen Z seeks out traditional, structured religion, the profound crisis of meaning can cause it to go disastrously, violently wrong.
We have to talk about the dark side of traditionalism.
Yeah.
The phenomenon of the orthobros.
This is a widely documented trend where young, disaffected, often very angry men are converting in large numbers to very strict traditional faiths, specifically Eastern Orthodox Christianity and radical traditionalist Catholicism.
On paper, you'd think these ancient churches would be thrilled. Young people are filling the pews. But the reality on the ground is an absolute nightmare for the priests and the existing congregations. Because these young men aren't coming to be humbled, they aren't coming for spiritual transformation or to learn grace.
No, they're bringing in incredibly toxic worldly ideologies, white nationalism, deep-seated anti-Semitism, and virulent aggressive misogyny.
Dreher, who is himself Orthodox, explains exactly why this specific hijacking happens, particularly in Orthodoxy. The Orthodox Church is structurally built around national and ethnic identities. You have the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, and so on.
Because of that structure, it becomes highly susceptible to young, rootless, angry Americans who are desperately projecting their desire for a fierce, controlling, exclusive tribe. They feel alienated by modern liberal culture, so they look for the most rigid, patriarchal, culturally foreign institution they can find.
They want a weapon to wield against their enemies, not a religion to heal their souls.
Theologically, the Church Fathers actually condemned this exact mindset centuries ago. It is a formal heresy known as philotism, the false belief that the Church exists solely for a specific ethnicity, nation, or political tribe.
But these kids don't care about theology or church councils. They are showing up demanding a spiritual justification for their rage. The source mentions that priests are now having to actively, aggressively deprogram these young men. They are having to break down this desire to sacralize their anger. The priests have to tell them, no, you cannot use the Eucharist as a badge of white supremacy. You cannot use ancient liturgy as a tool to control women.
And the source draws a fascinating, deeply relevant psychological connection here. It connects this intense misogyny within the orthobro movement directly to the profound fear of women cultivated in modern digital culture.
Dreher cites a recent, massively successful indie horror movie called Obsession. It was made for absolute pennies and grossed hundreds of millions of dollars precisely because it tapped into the darkest anxieties of the modern male psyche.
The plot centers on a young Gen Z man who completely lacks confidence. He's terrified of being rejected by a girl he has a crush on. He feels powerless. So he goes to a New Age shop and buys an occult charm that guarantees to make her love him more than anything in the world. He forces the universe to bend to his will.
It works. But the horrific twist is that she becomes so insanely obsessively attached to him that her love turns violent. She completely destroys his life, his friendships, his sanity. Dreher views this movie not just as a fun thriller, but as a crucial modern myth.
It perfectly reflects the absolute terror young men have today, that if they actually get what they want from a woman, if they become vulnerable, she will consume and destroy them.
It's a profound cultural observation. Young men feel battered by the digital culture of Instagram, OnlyFans, dating apps where rejection is public, metrics-driven, and deeply humiliating. This profound fear and feelings of inadequacy drive them in two directions.
Either toward the chaotic, rule-breaking power of the occult to force the world to give them what they want.
Right. Or toward weaponizing traditional religion as a tool of rigid patriarchal control to protect themselves from vulnerability.
Yeah.
So let me summarize where we are in this massive cultural shift. We have one faction of a generation playing with occult fire because they want profound magical meaning without any moral rules. And we have another faction trying to weaponize ancient religion for tribal political control and protection.
But here's the terrifying synthesis. Both factions are completely ignoring the actual, deadly, serious, independent reality of the spiritual realm. They both treat the supernatural as a tool they can wield, a toy they can play with, rather than an ancient force that can wield them.
Which brings us to the ultimate visceral proof of that danger. This is where the source material moves past cultural theory and gets undeniably terrifying. We have to discuss the reality of spiritual warfare and generational curses.
Dreher recounts the harrowing story of a couple he personally knows, whom he calls Emma and Nathan. And I want to set the scene carefully because this is not a story about marginalized people on the fringes of society or people struggling with severe, untreated mental illness in a rural backwater.
Not at all. They are highly educated, immensely wealthy, living in a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Nathan is a highly successful stockbroker. They are the epitome of the weird, successful elite. And they're described as super Catholic daily mass, actively involved in church charities, culturally sophisticated.
But Emma carried a deep, hidden burden. She had suffered severe childhood trauma that traditional therapy hadn't been able to fully resolve. Seeking spiritual relief, she attended a Catholic healing prayer service led by a priest who was known to have a specific charism or spiritual gift for healing trauma.
But when the priest laid hands on her and prayed over her, she didn't just feel peace. The reaction was violent and immediate. Something snapped. A demonic entity suddenly manifested through her. Her voice completely changed to a deep, guttural, masculine growl. Her physical demeanor completely transformed, displaying preternatural strength and visceral hatred.
Now, you hear a story like that, and the left-brained materialist reflex kicks in immediately. You think, okay, she had a psychotic break, she has a dissociative identity disorder triggered by religious trauma.
Right, that's what anyone would think.
And the Archdiocese of New York thought the exact same thing. They handled this incredibly methodically. They didn't jump straight to the supernatural. They sent her for a full, exhaustive psychiatric and medical evaluation to find any possible scientific explanation.
The Catholic Church is actually incredibly skeptical when it comes to possession. She was thoroughly examined by secular medical professionals, and she was cleared. They could find absolutely no medical, neurological, or psychiatric explanation for what was happening to her body, her voice, or her knowledge of hidden things.
Only after all medical avenues were exhausted did the psychiatrist officially approve her for a formal ritual exorcism.
And through the investigative process, working with a specially trained priest, preparing them for the exorcism, they uncovered the root cause of how this entity gained access to her. It wasn't anything Emma had done. It wasn't a sin she committed. It was what theology refers to as a generational curse.
They traced her lineage back to Italy. Emma's grandparents back in Europe had been deeply, actively involved in the occult. Her grandmother was a practicing serious witch, and her grandfather was a high-level Freemason deeply embedded in occult, anti-clerical rituals.
The theological argument here is essentially spiritual epigenetics. Just like you can inherit genetic trauma or generational debt from your parents, their actions opened a spiritual door that allowed an entity to attach itself to their bloodline. Emma inherited the spiritual debt of her grandparents.
To illustrate how viscerally real and independent this entity was, to prove it wasn't just a psychological projection, Dreher shares a personal experience. He visited Nathan and Emma at their Upper East Side apartment while they were waiting for the formal exorcism to take place.
This is the story of the hidden relic test, and it is spine-chilling. Think about this setting. A beautiful, modern apartment overlooking Manhattan. On the elevator ride up to the apartment, Nathan tells Dreher he is going to run a specific test to show him what they're dealing with. He says, at some point during our conversation, I'm going to get up to get us some lemonade. While I'm in the kitchen, completely out of Emma's sight, I am going to secretly slip a holy relic, a tiny piece of bone from a canonized saint, into my pocket. Watch exactly what happens when I walk back into the room.
The premise here is crucial for understanding how exorcists differentiate between mental illness and genuine possession. A demon will supposedly react violently to the presence of a genuinely holy object because the holiness burns them.
Crucially, they react, even if the human host cannot see the object and has absolutely no idea it is there. It completely rules out the placebo effect, psychological suggestion, or the host simply acting out a religious script.
So Dreher and Emma are sitting on the balcony, having a completely normal, sophisticated conversation about art or politics. Nathan is in the kitchen. He comes back out onto the balcony. He sets the tray of lemonade down. He hasn't even taken his seat yet. He hasn't said a word about the relic in his pocket.
The moment he crosses the threshold, Emma stops speaking mid-sentence. Her body goes rigid. Her head drops violently to her chest.
When she slowly raises her head, Dreher says her face was completely twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He said it was physically not her own face. Her eyes looked like they were literally on fire. She glares directly at her husband's pocket and in a guttural, terrifying growl, screams at him to keep that blankety-blank thing away from her. The entity knew exactly what was in the pocket.
Then, just as suddenly as it manifested, the energy snaps. Her head drops again. When she looks back up, the entity is gone. Emma is physically exhausted. She is weeping. She has absolutely no memory of what just happened over the last 30 seconds. And she looks at Dreher with overwhelming suffering and says, I'm so sorry. That's not me.
It is a horrifying violation of human autonomy. And this raises an important question. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable theological question. If Emma was a good person, going to Mass, living a charitable life, doing everything right, why does God allow this kind of horrific suffering? Why allow a demon to torture an innocent woman for the sins of her grandparents?
Winston Marshall actually brings up this exact theological tension during the interview. He mentions an interview that Tucker Carlson recently did with a very famous exorcist named Father Chad Ripperger. Winston was deeply unsettled by that interview because Ripperger seemed to suggest that God controls demons like dogs on a leash, or that demons are somehow good for us because they test our faith and make us stronger.
Winston's concern is incredibly valid. He worried that framing demons as useful tools of God could dangerously encourage young people to play with the occult. If a teenager thinks, well, God is in control of the demons, so they can't really hurt me, it's all part of a divine game, they are going to be much more likely to mess around with a Ouija board or a summoning ritual.
Dreher clarifies this dangerous misconception by referencing the Exorcist Files podcast, hosted by Father Carlos Martins, another highly experienced exorcist. Martins vehemently pushes back on the idea that God uses demons as tools. He emphasizes that God does not will evil. He doesn't create evil for us to suffer through as some kind of cosmic test.
However, the theology dictates that in a fallen world, a world where humans have free will to make terrible choices like Emma's grandparents did, God permits the consequences of that evil to play out for reasons that are profoundly mysterious and often beyond our understanding. Emma suffered terribly due to the actions of her ancestors, not her own sins. God permitted the suffering, but he didn't author it as a punishment.
Dreher notes that it took years of grueling struggle, multiple exorcisms, and deep spiritual counseling. But God eventually did free Emma from the possession. The demonic right to her bloodline was broken. But it wasn't a quick fix, and it left deep scars.
The enduring lesson from that horrifying ordeal comes from her husband, Nathan. He told Dreher that going through this multi-year nightmare completely shattered his comfortable, weird, materialist worldview. He said, "Now I realize when I'm walking the streets of Manhattan, looking at all these wealthy, sophisticated people staring at their phones, that all around me there's a great, terrifying spiritual battle happening that we just can't see."
It is a profound realization. It forces you to look at the world and at human history through an entirely different lens. And that really is the synthesis of our entire journey today. We have covered an immense amount of ground, but there's a distinct thread connecting all of it.
There really is.
We started with government whistleblowers and intelligence agencies, quietly admitting that the UFO phenomenon is likely comprised of interdimensional entities rather than biological aliens. The hardware is a disguise for the software.
We moved through the history of how that software might have been downloaded. We looked at occultists like Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons allegedly tearing open the veil between dimensions in the 1940s, right as the modern UFO era began, and pop culture began conditioning us to view these entities as saviors rather than demons.
We explored how our weird, highly educated, completely left-brain society blinded us to the spiritual realities our ancestors took for granted. We traded our ability to perceive divine meaning for immense technological power, leaving us rich but spiritually starving.
And we ended by looking at the terrifying consequences of that starvation. A younger generation plunging headfirst into the occult because they desperately want enchantment without rules, angry young men weaponizing ancient faith for tribal control, and ordinary people facing the visceral, horrifying reality of spiritual warfare right in the middle of modern-day, highly educated Manhattan.
This deep dive was fundamentally about zooming out. It's about seeing the invisible threads connecting these bizarre, seemingly unrelated phenomena. Whether you view this as literal demonic warfare, exactly as Dreher and Vallée do, or if you view this as a profound psychological crisis in a post-meaning world, the historical amnesia we are suffering from is very real. We have forgotten things our ancestors used to know. We threw away our armor because we thought we had outgrown the need for it.
The materialist paradigm is fracturing. It cannot hold all the anomalous data anymore. The things we suppressed, the ancient fears we medicalized, they are returning. And they are returning in forms that are custom-tailored to deceive us based on what we currently worship.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling thought to mull over before we go. We spent this time talking about how the sources argued that our modern scientific arrogance blinded us to ancient spiritual dangers. We think we are too smart to be fooled by demons. We think we'd know a monster if we saw one. But I want you, the listener, to consider this.
Yeah, think about this.
What if our hyper-connected, technology-obsessed society isn't just ignoring these spiritual forces? What if we are actually building the exact digital infrastructure that they need to operate? Think about the omnipresent screens, the rise of AI companions that mimic human emotion, the algorithmic isolation that feeds our deepest anxieties and desires. What if we are building a world that makes us the most spiritually vulnerable generation in human history to interdimensional deception?
It's a terrifying thought.
If a portal to the unseen world can open in a 1980 Chicago kitchen, what is opening through the black mirror of the screen you are holding in your hand right now? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking deeper, don't ignore the anomalies, and most importantly, keep questioning the consensus. We'll catch you next time.